President, we listened to the presentation of the 39th report of the so-called Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court regarding the situation in Darfur. There's nothing new here. On the one hand, the usual bluster regarding non-existent successes, and on the other, self-justification and finger-pointing regarding the all-too-real failures. We were exasperated that the Security Council, since 2005, every 6 months has to spend scarce time and resources on considering this kind of useless pro forma reports. This one is no exception. Mr. Khan is once again justifying the ineffectiveness of his entity, referring to complex situations, a lack of resources and insufficient cooperation. The ICC always has to blame someone else. The same people who pontificate on the responsibility of the staff of this pseudo-legal structure are not rushing to take responsibility themselves when it pertains to their own failures. For Mr. Khan, this is a well-worn tactic. We hear his vague reports. We heard his vague reports as when he was head of UNITAD, but until it became clear that the structure under his leadership essentially did nothing. But over this time, he'd already moved to the ICC. It's high time for colleagues on the Security Council to look truth in the eyes and draw sober conclusions. 2 decades of reports from ICC prosecutors have only served one goal: to pretend to be busy against the backdrop of blatant sabotage of the tasks that bestowed upon them by the Council. The current situation in Sudan more than ever refutes the jaded theory that the ICC's involvement allegedly assists national reconciliation and stabilisation. On the contrary, this body, which has nothing to do with justice, and in carrying out political orders of its masters, merely worsens the situation, and also overplays the role as a battering ram for regime change, as was the case in Libya, with the arrest warrants for local leadership justified by low-grade fake information. Indeed, no staff from the ICC have ever been held accountable for fabricating evidence of non-existent wrongdoing. Created to distract, the internal investigation predictably went nowhere. You wanted us to forget about this, Mr. Khan, but we won't. There's a large amount of proof of crimes of NATO countries which were deliberately swept under the carpet by the pseudo-court and its puppet prosecutors. No one from the Western military, or even, let alone the leaders, were held accountable for the atrocities in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as the military aggression against Libya. This peak double standards and hypocrisy has turned the so-called ICC into the international criminal disgrace, discrediting the very concept of international criminal justice. The high hopes of the international community were not fated to be fulfilled. With the creation of the ICC, the collective West simply had yet another obedient instrument on which to impose their will and implement their hegemonic wishes. Against this backdrop, it is no surprise, that this ongoing farce is no surprise, which aims to cover up for the complete inaction on the situation in Gaza. We would recall this situation has been before the prosecutors of the ICC since 2015. So, for almost 10 years now, not a single real step has been taken to fight impunity. The International Court of Justice, which is not a criminal entity and also got involved much later in the situation, already, against the backdrop of the current escalation of the situation, has taken much more decisive action. So, what can the ICC boast of against this backdrop? Only dubious PR actions. And over the last 10 months, a real bloodbath and humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, well, Mr. Khan has simply not done anything about that. For some reason, the media trumpeted a request, not an issuance, of arrest warrants. But it's been 2 months, more than 2 months since then. On the 27th of June, the request for arrest warrants was suspended by the pre-trial chamber. In addition, the process for issuing warrants was stopped by the UK, the country of citizenship of Mr. Khan, who submitted for this process to take place. It's an interesting coincidence, wouldn't you say? This whole situation clearly shows that the ICC obediently implements the policies of their Western masters, in advance agreeing all of their manoeuvres with them. For example, the British application for intervention was possible only thanks to Mr. Khan's provision of information regarding the request for warrants to be issued. It's notable that in other situations, these kind of announcements were not made. On the contrary, even after the issuance of warrants, often information about them was kept secret for years. We saw the news that the new British government publicly announced that they intend to no longer dispute the issuance of warrants. This only confirms the theory that this was never a question of justice from the very outset. Sending it or not is simply a political decision of the West. Today they hinder it, tomorrow they graciously allow it to happen. Here, justice, fairness and the fight against impunity is simply a cover for political interests and under-the-table games of the elites of countries in the collective West. No less indicative are the manoeuvres of the US, who either impose sanctions on ICC staff or they lift them, but only to impose them later. Washington, not even a party to the Rome Statute of the Court, publicly applies the carrot and stick tactic to them, reminding the staff there of this pseudo-legal body, whom they really serve and whose interests they defend. However, let's go back to the so-called report on the situation in Darfur. This paper clearly demonstrates the complete futility and dysfunctionality of the ICC. The only trial on Kushaib started 17 years after the situation in Darfur was referred to the ICC. This is a pretense of work and makes an open mockery of the concept of justice. The 20 years of procrastination of the ICC on Darfur and its direct complicity in the destruction of the Libyan state means that concrete conclusions must be made. It's understandable that the Security Council should never again refer new situations to this pseudo-court. This is a given and is not even being discussed. The Security Council should recall both the Darfur and Libyan file from the ICC. We don't see any point in continuing routine hearing of empty reports. The ICC itself sees the Security Council only as a commodity, trying to increase its own importance through its alleged inclusion in the Security Council's agenda. Here, this pseudo-court, after 20 years of inaction, now, with the go-ahead from its Western masters, suddenly is interested in the situation in Sudan. Their staff, for some reason, are convinced that there is a jurisdiction regarding recent events. In this connection, I'd like to underscore, in 2005, the investigation for a specific situation was referred to the ICC. The ICC completely failed at this task. The Council has not given instructions to investigate this new escalation. Thus, the ICC is without ceremony and blatantly stepping outside of its mandate, interpreting Security Council resolutions as best suits them. The generally dubious track record of the ICC speaks volumes that justice, fairness and concern for victims is simply empty rhetoric for this court. Members of the Security Council, it's time that members of the Security Council stop spending time on useless presentations of the prosecutors of this body and focus on assistance to national judicial bodies. Time and time again, practice has shown if anyone is able to address tasks of achieving national reconciliation and stabilisation, it is them. Thank you for your attention.